The Human Rights Council is a body that's existed since 2006. It has 47 members that are on the council for a 3-year term, and Russia would have been on the council until 2023. Now, I think countries decided to pursue the suspension yesterday to really use all available avenues to sanction Russia's aggression against Ukraine and show that incidents like the killings in Bucha this past weekend will not be without consequence. But I would say that in terms of the direct impact, this is probably more a symbolic move, given the limited competencies of this body. Russia remains a veto power-wielding permanent member on the UN Security Council. Now, in terms of Russia's reaction, Russia, of course, has called this move illegal and politically motivated. And rather than enduring the suspension, it announced yesterday that it would quit, which is very much in line with what Russia did about a month ago regarding the Council of Europe. So Russia wants to be seen as proactive, as quitting these bodies rather than being expelled. And Russia's characterization of the Human Rights Council is now very much in line with what it said about international bodies in recent years, bodies that take decisions that Russia disagrees with. Russia claims that they are politically hijacked by the United States and its allies, that they are used to pursue political agendas against Moscow and its allies. And so if you look at the domestic narrative, Yvonne, this is now very much about saying these bodies are irrelevant anyway. They don't reflect the realities of international politics anymore. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, asked on his Telegram channel this morning, how long will the Human Rights Council survive after this decision? So the narrative here is very much, we don't care. But I do think that Russia sees this as insulting somewhat to its status as a self-perceived great power, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And I've also heard that there's some indignation in Moscow with certain countries that were at least expected to abstain yesterday, countries like Serbia, which ended up supporting this suspension. So I would say a mixed picture here.
Well, Hanna, which countries didn't support the suspension, and what can you tell us about the reasons why?
So we've had quite a few abstentions actually yesterday, abstentions and votes against the suspension. China and India, of course, significant. These are countries that have tried to walk a careful balancing act since the beginning of the invasion. If we look at the Indian statements at the UN Security Council debate on Bucha a few days ago, for instance, India didn't even mention the Russian Federation once. But I think to understand the nuanced factors as to why countries abstain and sort of carefully balance, the Middle East is a great region to look at. So here, every single Gulf country, GCC country abstained, as did Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Morocco didn't even show up for the vote. And, you know, these are countries that have built political and economic relations with Russia for years, against a perception of declining U.S. interest in their region. I would say there's also perception in the Middle East that really the Ukraine war is not their war. And there's a certain indignation, I would almost say, with a perceived sort of double standard by the international community. Now that there's war in Ukraine, everyone is very much engaged. And then when we had Syria, Yemen, the Palestinian conflict, we saw less of that reaction. So I think countries are also upset about that. So I would say that the reasons as to why countries abstain are sort of multifaceted, and there's not one single reason.
Meanwhile, the US Congress has voted to strip Moscow of its preferential trade status, banning imports of Russian energy into the US. How damaging will this be?
That's right, Yvonne. I would say that the impact of this latest decision by the US Congress will be limited in sort of real terms, since bilateral annual trade between the United States and Russia is not all that significant. I think Russia was the United States' 23rd largest trade partner in 2021. But of course, the sanctions are building up. Sberbank has also just been sanctioned. The EU announced its 5th sanctions package against Russia, which is due to include a coal embargo. So I would say, on the one hand, of course, the Russian economy is under unprecedented pressure. Some predict that the Russian economy will perhaps contract by 15% this year. And you do hear anecdotally, I hear it from my contacts in Moscow, that sort of shortage of daily products is being felt among Russians. But then on the other hand, you have to mention that oil and gas continues to be sold by Russia, and Russia gets significant incomes. I mean, the EU stated this past week that it spent 35 billion euros on Russian energy since the start of this invasion. So if the intention, as the United States put it, is to starve the Russian war machine, I think with the current sanctions effort, we will not see that. I think we will not decimate Russia's military industrial complex and its ability to wage this war over the immediate term. I think the impact here will, if anything, be more over the medium term.
And Hanna, in speaking to your contacts in Russia, how do you think the average Russian is viewing this invasion more than a month on?
It's, of course, difficult to say because we cannot really rely on polls, and so the evidence is more anecdotal. But I would say to you that, I mean, many were in shock when the war started and didn't expect this invasion. I was in Moscow until a day before the war started, and certainly none of my contacts saw it coming. What I fear now we see is an apparent consolidation among a majority of Russians behind the government. And I want to mention here three factors that I see. One I would call adaptive behavior. A lot of people now say they support the Kremlin because they feel a certain social pressure to do so. There's, of course, also a fear of reprisal. And so this drives this kind of adaptive behavior because it's simply the best way to just go on with everyday life. That is sort of amplified by what I would call besieged fortress. A lot of Russians, including those who were sort of internationally exposed and inclined, feel that their country's isolation and life under sanctions will be for a very, very long time. And so now that their country is mobilized against these immense outside pressures, even for people who were against this war, there is now this consolidation, perhaps this growing patriotism. And then the third factor, let's not forget about the effect of Russian state propaganda, the sheer mass of very detailed narratives that is thrown at Russians by the state media in terms of threats of weapons of mass destruction allegedly emanating from Ukraine, or what really transpired in Bucha this past weekend. What it does at a minimum is creating a lot of confusion, I think, among the average Russians who then say, oh, the situation's really complicated. We will never really know what truly transpired. And why should we believe the version that the Western media is presenting? And so I think all these factors now constantly reinforce each other. And unfortunately, they have produced a situation where Russians are not turning against their government at this point in time.
Mm. And finally, NATO's warning this war will go on for months. Do you think Russia was expecting it to? Is it prepared enough for a long, protracted fight?
I think Russia was absolutely not prepared for it. They went into this invasion expecting regime change in Kiev within days. Now the big question, I agree with you, is are they up for a war of attrition, for a protracted fight? I mean, they have to some extent adjusted their war aims. Russian troops have now withdrawn from the north of Ukraine, appear to be focusing on the Donbass, on the east and the south. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, did acknowledge yesterday, I think it was quite astonishing, that there are significant losses of troops, and he called it a huge tragedy for Russia. Now, I would argue to you that the longer this war lasts and the more losses Russia will incur, the harder it will be to sell this to your population as a quote-unquote special military operation with limited aims and with limited scope. Now, what concerns me personally is there is now a certain Russian narrative appearing, published in certain articles by Russian state media, amplified by certain Russian officials, that the denazification one has to pursue in Ukraine is not just limited to the leadership, to the elite, but that it has to go deeper. So is that a way of Russia sort of preparing its population for a more all-encompassing, protracted war? I think, that is a worrying question. And the other question to me is, once that is what you've been telling your people, you need to pursue denazification in Ukraine, how do you climb down from those demands to more realistic aims if the military situation on the ground dictates that? And will Vladimir Putin be prepared to do that? Or will he choose to go all in and escalate with yet uglier means, use of unconventional weapons or such things? I think that is what we need to observe going forward.